Thanks everyone for being here today. Glad to join you. And I'm super, super excited to introduce someone who I think when we get in person is going to be like a real life friend, Ty Mckinney. We had a chance to catch up a few weeks ago, and I'm very excited about his presentation, getting us started really talking about neurodivergency in the workplace. So Ty, I am going to hand it to you. Thanks so much for being here.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. So to continue on the theme for all the other speakers, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge my why. So I'll be very open and transparent. I've struggled with mental health myself over the years. But I know that I'm not alone in this particular challenge. So I worked in organizations where my superpower is often my creativity and the way that I can bring a lot of analytics and insight into situations. But that hasn't always been appreciated within corporate structures, a little bit more rigid. And unfortunately, that's led to me falling through the cracks a little bit, and some of the shame that comes with that. And as I said, I know that this isn't necessarily a unique situation to me. I've seen this happen to my friends, I've seen it happen to my family, and to my colleagues. So that's really what inspired me to pursue a career in researching how we could do a better job of tackling mental health. And while I was getting my degree, I realized there's a specific niche when it came to assessment and how we could use technology in order to remove some of the bias in the process. So that's how I got into a career in science. And over the last couple of years, I've been very fortunate and blessed to be able to transition into entrepreneurship and taking that research background and seeing how we can actually make products and services to make a difference within the workplace. So that's what I'm excited to share with you today, is what me and my team at Bit Cortex has been doing to make that difference a reality. And I want to start off by just helping make sure that we're all appreciating the financial cost of burnout. I think we all intuitively understand the personal cost that comes with it, but there's some numbers behind it that I think are really important to touch on, and that I'm actually really happy that a lot of the panelists so far have validated in a few different directions. So let's say you have a company of about 50 people, not too big, not too small, just right. Based on a recent report from KPMG, we would anticipate that there would be about a 10% turnover during the last couple of years due to burnout. So this isn't people being fired. This is people voluntarily leaving their place of work for one reason or another. And of this company of about 50 people, if 5 people were to leave, this would cost them about $200,000 a year, assuming those are mid-level employees. As a bit of a rule of thumb, if you spread this out over the course of the entire organization, this would be about $4,000 per employee per year in Canadian dollars. And for all our American friends and colleagues, it's about $3,000. So quite large numbers. And actually, based on some of the stats that Felipe was saying, this actually might be an underestimate from some of his data. And again, to really break down these costs a little bit more, we can think about in a series of individual components of increasing escalation. So to start off with, there is absenteeism. This is when people show up to the workplace and they're not 100%. So they're doing their job, but they're not doing it particularly effectively or efficiently. So that ends up costing some lost productivity. Or they might not show up at all. They might take sick days and just be a little bit more absent within the workplace. So that's one cost to the company. If those problems aren't addressed and the mental health challenges persist, this can lead towards short-term disability, where someone needs to take a stress leave. And again, they're not present in their job, and it's further costing the company money because their salary is still being paid while they're not doing the work. And oftentimes there needs to be some compensation productivity-wise within the company. Again, if the problem continues to persist, then the person might leave the position entirely and cause turnover. So then you have this unfilled position on a more longer term basis, continuing to drain the company of money. And to fix this problem, there's going to need to be a rehiring process, which is also quite costly. Again, Felipe could probably talk a little bit more about the exact cost of that, but they get quite high. And then another one that was touched on is that if these problems really aren't addressed chronically long-term at the organizational level, this will create health consequences for everyone involved, both mentally and physically. And that's going to start to be reflected in higher insurance premiums. So overall, burnout is a really costly problem. So I think that we all have a moral imperative to solve this challenge, not only because it's the right thing to do, but also because it's the good business decision. So now what I want to talk about is an aspect of neurodiversity so that we can start to think about how we can start tackling this problem in a way that works really good and is equitable for everyone. And just for that note, I want to talk about dopamine, one of my favorite neurotransmitters. Not my favorite one, one of my favorites. So dopamine is really important for signaling rewards and surprises within the brain. And if you see the diagram on the right, there's one brain structure that's highlighted in red. This is my second favorite brain structure, the cingulate cortex. And dopamine is really important for turning on a broader network that's important for what's called executive functioning. So it's got a really important signal that way. And very briefly, what executive functioning allows us to do is resist our temptations, inhibit impulses, allow us to emotionally regulate, and pursue our long-term goals. So all really important things. And if you didn't quite catch that, don't worry, I have memes. So quick show of hands to the audience. How many people can eat a single Lay's potato chip? Okay, there's 2 people. So basically, for everyone that did not raise their hand, you can blame your executive functioning for your inability to only eat a single potato chip. And the 2 people that raised their hands, you have superpowers. So again, executive function is what allows us to resist those temptations and inhibit tendencies that might not necessarily be in our best interest. But this is just where it starts. That core cognitive process gets elaborated upon through more broader brain networks. So again, as I was saying, executive functioning is what allows us to pursue our long-term goals. And if you don't have good executive functioning, then you have this meme happening where literally anything else will distract you from your goals. And as a person with ADHD, I'm particularly vulnerable to this aspect of low executive functioning. And a lot of us are professionals here in the crowd. So that probably means in some way we're paid to be attentive to details, whether or not that's details in your clients, details in data, or just details more broadly in your personal life. And again, if you don't have good executive functioning online, you're going to find it hard to pay attention to those details. So you're going to start to make mistakes, errors are going to pop up, and those can be costly both for the company as well as in personal terms for you. So again, these are all situations that we really don't want. And the way to do that is to boost executive functioning. So this is where dopamine comes back into the story. So so there's a curvilinear relationship between dopamine and executive functioning. Again, it's kind of like a Goldilocks scenario. You don't want too much dopamine. You don't want too little dopamine. You want it just right. And again, when you have just the right amount of dopamine, it activates the cingulate cortex and turns on executive functioning, and we're able to do all the amazing, wonderful, complex tasks that we need to do. But not everyone is built the same. This is where the neurodiversity piece comes in. So some people can be a little bit more on the introverted side of the spectrum, on the opposite of extroversion. And these people, on average, tend to have a little bit more dopamine at baseline compared to the typical person. So as a result, they need to actually lower their dopamine levels in order to get into that ideal zone of, in order to get their executive functioning going. So this has some implications for the work environments that they want to operate within. Over the course of the last couple of years, a lot of us have had to switch to working remotely and from our own homes. This has been a paradise for introverts because they're able to control their environment, they're able to find their inner peace, and they're able to really find ways to reduce all those distractions, calm themselves down, and get into that state of mind where they're able to really get into the zone and activate their executive functioning at their full capacity. But then you also have extroverts. They're on the other end of the spectrum. So they tend to have a little less dopamine at baseline. So as you might expect, they need, in many cases, the opposite kind of a scenario. They need a little bit of extra stimulation in their environment in order to push their dopamine levels up into that ideal range. So for these people, they actually tend to prefer an office environment. They tend to thrive when there is a lot of energy around, a lot of socialization opportunities, a lot of social accountability, those sorts of situations. So you can start to appreciate how just when we think about introverts and extroverts, there's different needs that people are going to have. And if you have a one-size-fits-all approach, you're inevitably going to be leaving someone behind. So there needs to be some degree of flexibility to really make the workplace accommodating for neurodiverse individuals. But up until this point, I really just talked about what a scientist would call statistically normal people, where this is broadly within the normal range of functioning. But what happens if your dopamine levels are even lower than the typical extrovert? This is one of the things that's strongly associated with ADHD. So people with ADHD, they have particularly low levels of dopamine at baseline. So this presents a few unique challenges in the way that a workplace really needs to be supportive for their environments. So one of the ways that people with ADHD tend to cope with this is they tend to make their environment more stimulating. different coping strategies. And sometimes this is helpful, sometimes this is not. We know from the scientific literature that, as this meme illustrates, a lot of people with ADHD will try to multitask, do lots of different things, because this is a way to make their work more exciting for them. But it's not particularly effective. When you work like this, it tends to actually make people less efficient overall, even though the people with ADHD think they're being more efficient. So instead, now we have to think about, okay, how can we find ways to really cultivate the superpowers that people with ADHD have in order to let them shine without necessarily creating an environment that tampers their success. And this is where it really comes down to finding ways in which their skills can be well suited to their job. So as an entrepreneur, I'm actually very fortunate that ADHD is a benefit for me. People with ADHD tend to be risk takers. They tend to be very good at multitasking relative to most people. And they tend to be very rewards focused. So as an entrepreneur, those are all really valuable assets that I can bring to my current job. And I think this is a more generalized idea about how we can find ways to start curating the ways in which jobs are structured to really match the brain structure that people are bringing to the workplace. So at Bit Cortex, we have an app that we've developed in order to collect data about different aspects of neurodiversity and mental well-being. So in the chat, there's been a link that's been passed around. It looks like we got a bunch more people signed up over the course of the sessions this morning, so thank you, everyone. So this is an example of what the dashboard can look like on our app in order to help organizations make more data-driven decisions for how they can be more inclusive with respect to neurodiversity. And I want to finish off this part of it by actually sharing a quote from one of our first clients. So they had a relatively small team, and they used our service looking at neurodiversity. And I'll just read this out directly to clarify that, and then talk about how they're able to use this to make it more beneficial. So this small business owner said that being able to extract the information and to have a deeper understanding of the different personality profiles and how it affects both their level and type of burnout was very helpful. So with this client, they're able to recognize that they actually had some gaps within their neurodiversity profile. In particular, they need a couple more people that were more on the conscientious side of the scale. So when they did their next round of hiring, they're able to specifically look for people that filled those gaps in order to make their team overall more integrated. So that way it wasn't too much of one type, it was a more spread out even mix. So on this point, I'll ask the AV people to switch over to the dashboard, and we're going to see what the neurodiversity profile of our audience looks like. There we go. So basically, you can see there's the 5 different factors of the Big 5 personality model. So what I'm just going to briefly do is interpret this in a very gisty way as though this were one of my clients. This is an organization that I would look at. So the first thing that really stands out to me is that there's a really high degree of agreeableness in this group. So that means we're probably very supportive, we're very empathetic, we're very collaborative, but this also runs a little bit of a risk. So this has the possibility you might get some groupthink happening. If an organization looks like this, they might not necessarily want to rock the boat. And as a result, in trying to be supportive for one another, they might actually not be doing the necessary challenging necessary to make sure that everyone's being mindful about everything going on. That's one potential red flag that I can see from looking at this profile. Additionally, seems like we're all relatively low on conscientiousness. So this suggests that we're all very fly by the seat of our pants kind of people. We enjoy being dynamic, living in the moment. But this means we might also struggle with some rules and process a little bit. So one thing that you'd want to try to work with this group of individuals is find some ways to make the processes easier for them to follow. So that way it doesn't feel as effortful and burdensome. Going back to the extroversion that I was previously talking about, it looks like we're actually within the realm of normality here. So it looks like we're a good group of both extroverts and introverts. So we got a good balance there. Neuroticism, a sensitivity to stress and negative emotions. Again, we're about normal there. So again, there's a good balance there. So this would be indicative of overall a fairly healthy organization. And the other thing that really jumps out is openness. We're an extremely open-minded group of people here at the Workplace Wellness Collective. So this means that we're going to be innovative, we're going to be entrepreneurial, and be very willing to pursue new ideas. The downside of this is that we might pursue too many ideas at once. So one recommendation that I would make for an organization like this is try to prioritize the ideas. find out which ones are most critical for your mission and which ones are nice, but not necessarily necessary, because those might be red herrings that might otherwise take away from a more cohesive mission. So that's kind of how to interpret the personality profile of neurodiversity for the Workplace Wellness Collective. For the remaining time that I have, I want to open up to the audience, both in person as well as virtually. What are some questions you would have about how we could use this data within your own organizations? We'll just get you to rephrase into the mic.
Would people use this to know who to hire? So once they have a team, if the team isn't working and they're not productive, can they take this and you give them the data and you could say, no, well, you really need to bring in some more introverts or extroverts, and can that help them line up what their team is?
100%. Again, it'll really depend on what kind of a company they are, kind of what their goals are, what their workflows are like. So there's always that contextual piece. But again, if there's clear gaps like there was with our first client, they needed more conscientious people. So they needed more box tickers that got a lot of joy out of just following through with process. And that helped them take a very entrepreneurial organization and restructure things to be a little bit more systematic and progress-based. Yeah, so really good question there.
What does cube rush score mean and how to interpret that?
Okay, really good question. So one of the key innovations that we have at Bit Cortex is that we're trying to gamify the mental wellness tracking process. So our very first prototype was a game we developed called Cube Rush, where it's measuring your momentary attention capacity. So we can use this to get an index of burnout in a much more objective sense. One of the components of burnout is lower degrees of cognitive efficacy. So you're trying, but your executive functioning isn't quite working despite your best efforts. So that will be reflected in the Cube Rush score. So we can use that and the patterns of that in relation to other variables collected from the workplace to give an overall sense of the burnout risk for the organization, as well as try to make some suggestions for how they can mitigate that risk. And again, for the neurodiversity lens, whether or not there's certain groups of people that are at higher risk for burnout than others. Again, really trying to reduce those inequalities. That's a really good question. Thank you.
An online audience, is there any question? Jen, do you have any questions that you can help facilitate for Ty from our LinkedIn or Zoom audience, please?
Sure, absolutely, Sumana. Thank you so much. And I'll pull it straight from our Zoom chat, which is from Michelle. How would you recommend leaders share this information with their teams so that members can begin to collaborate on communication styles that is supportive to the members' needs?
That's a really good question. So I think the first thing just comes with really normalizing these kinds of conversations and recognizing that we're all unique individuals. What works for me is not going to work for you or the next person, and that's completely fine. But ironically, that's contrary to the way a lot of companies work, where there's a one-size-fits-all process, and that allows people to fall through the cracks. So just normalizing the fact that we can be different, and that can be a source of strength, a source of resilience. And then from there, asking people about what their needs are, how they can do a better job of trying to support one another, what kind of things would help them. That really gets the ball rolling for just brainstorming and trying to get this process going. And then as a shameless plug, we can help you be more data-driven about that process.
Yes, I'm here for a shameless plug. I'm okay with that. We do have another great question. If an organization shows up as more agreeable, is that an indicator that the organization lacks diversity?
Not necessarily. So the one thing that isn't quite reflected in this graph is that there's going to be variability. This is showing the profile on average. When I do this service with our clients, I actually go through and break down a lot more statistics in order to find out like what's the distribution, what's the variability. So it might be the case that you have, 3/4 of the organization is very agreeable and 1/3 of the organization is not quite so agreeable. So in this case, you actually would have a diverse organization, even though on average you're more agreeable. So not necessarily. And again, we have to get into some of the stats to really dive into that.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Is
Oh,
there one? It looks like there might be one there in the audience.
Yes.
Hi, Ty. Let me think how I want to word this. I'm curious, do you make specific recommendations to the employer. For example, if you notice that an organization or a company is lacking maybe that type of employee who likes to check the boxes, will you make specific recommendations and ask, have you looked at hiring more diverse types of employees? Because we know certain characteristics amongst kind of neurodivergent thinking, there are types of employees that love to follow a list and check off the list and maybe do the things that are, I want to be careful with my wording, maybe the more mundane tasks that those of us with ADHD go, I am going to tear out my hair with boredom if you keep asking me to do this.
Yeah.
I hope that made sense.
Yeah. So again, I think it really comes down to what's the position that they're hiring for. So for example, if you overall have low conscientious people in the organization, but you're hiring for a sales position, you actually might want someone that's, again, high on the extroversion, is a little bit more okay with kind of being more free flowing, because those are the traits that are actually going to be more adaptive in that particular position. But if you're hiring for a manager or a taskmaster, then exactly what you just said, when you hire for someone like that, you do want to find someone that's much more on the conscientious side, where they're going to get the validation out of ticking those boxes, making sure the process is happening. So that way the company can keep chugging along. So in general, not necessarily, but when it comes to the specific position, yes. Yeah. And then I think Jen said that there was one more online before we get to the
Yeah, I have one more that I think is interesting from online, and that is kind of around how data is used. So how can organizations use this information inclusively, not against employees?
100%. So again, really the way that we try to use this data is to find ways to support the individuals within their work environment. So one of the things that we'll do is, as part of our process, we'll have people use our app for 10 minutes a day over the course of a week. And this allows us to get a lot of information about the environment that people are working in, the context. So based on that, we can find out what's working. Is it working overall, or is it only working for certain kinds of people? So then we can be much more data-driven in those recommendations. And then with respect to not having it be used against people, we ensure anonymity in all the services that we do. So we won't do any sort of a breakdown of groups of less than 10 people. So in that way, no individual person could be singled out as being flagged for a risk for burnout in that case. Because again, we want to support people, not accidentally give companies the ammunition to fire someone. That's the exact opposite of what we want to do. Instead, we want to find ways that they can change the environment so the person at risk for burnout becomes at less risk for burnouts.
Absolutely. Thanks for making that clarification that yes, what we want is to protect and support wellness overall. So Ty, thank you so much, Dr. McKinney. Thank you so much for the presentation. I think it was fascinating. And I hope that we have lots of great points to utilize in the next part of our program, which is a continued panel discussion around neurodiversity in the workplace.